Hi there. Today we are going to talk about the causes of wars, why wars happen. One thing you need to understand is war is never an accident. There is always some agenda, some reason that is involved. At individual level, there can be ambition, miscalculation, or hatred of leaders that can lead to war. This is something that is particularly seen in the authoritarian regimes, for example, Adolf Hitler's personal obsession with the idea of Lebensraum. Lebensraum basically means living space. So Adolf Hitler wanted to have certain part of Europe to himself so that because he thought that it was essential for the survival of the people of Germany. So this individual ambition, this individual notion or idea that can also lead to war. Secondly, at state level, war may involve some domestic politics. It may be due to economy or it may also be due to the survival of regime. For example, leaders start war to stay in power. They also start war so that they can divert attention from the internal problems or because their regime type encourages aggression. For example, Narendra Modi's government used Balakot airstrike in 2019 and Galwan response in 2020 to boost domestic popularity during election. So war can also be a tool. War can be a tool for the domestic politics as well or for the survival of a regime as well. So war do not have to have external aims at all times. It's not that you want to destroy an enemy that is causing war, or you want something from the enemy, you want resources of the enemy, or you just want to simply show your power, project power to the enemy. Sometimes it is internal factors. You simply want to divert attention from what is wrong, what is weak inside your own state. So that is also one of the key aspects that can lead to war. Next, the third level is the kind in which the war happens due to the systemic uh, uh, reasons. For example, anarchy, that is the absence of a central world government, or it can be due to the balance of power, or simply a security dilemma. And the famous, most relevant example is that of US China Great Power Competition 2020 to 2025. We know that America is pivoting to Asia via AUKUS and Quad. And as a result, now China feels America is trying to, overpower. America is trying to dominate. So what China does is it increases its military spending. So in this, they're just simply trying to balance power. They are basically projecting their powers, and this is also one of the things that may eventually lead to war. So at individual level, it can be the personal ambition, it can be a personal drive, it can be a personal ideology or a hope or a dream or even a hatred for a particular person that can cause war, as we saw the case of Adolf Hitler. At state level, there can be reasons like domestic politics. It can also be due to the economy. For example, if the country it feels like its resources are not enough to help its own population, sustain or live effectively, it will rather look and it will rather have greed towards certain regions that have more resources and will try to simply capture them. So that is also one of the things that can lead to war. And at lastly, there's systemic wars. That is what happens when there's anarchy, and just this war happens due to the balance of power or simply a security dilemma. When one side is increasing its military spending, it is basically giving a message to the other sides who feel vulnerable and in order to prepare for the incoming or in order to prepare for the prospective war, what they do is they also pile up their own arsenal, and this is something that can lead to wars. And then there are certain classical theories. Number one of that of Thucydides, he said that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. So basically, it was the rise of Athens. And when one side is rising, then you just fear that maybe that is going to overpower you, and that fear will lead you to war. So it was the rise of Athens and fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. So according to Thucydides, there can be three reasons behind war. Number one is fear, number two is honor, number three is interest. Now, you must also understand war, it is like a mega form of crime. So, all crime also happens due to fear or due to honor or due to interest. So, number one, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine started in 2022, still ongoing, Putin repeatedly said if Ukraine joins NATO and gets nuclear capable missiles, then it is going to be a problem. So, what Russia is actually afraid of being encircled by the NATO. So Russia invades Ukraine just to exert its dominance, just to make sure that Ukraine is not does not get into the NATO, and the NATO does not simply encircle the Russia, which would be very dangerous and which would compromise the Russia's deterrent. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine is based on fear. So it's basically preventive war that is driven by the fear of encirclement. So fear can be the reason, and fear is the oldest and strongest cause of war. Fear is the oldest as well as the strongest cause of war. That's what Hans Morgenthau said. Now, World War One it started in 1940 when Austria-Hungary issued harsh ultimatum to Serbia. And we all know that it started with the assassination of archdukes, and it was because they felt that their honor was as a great power was insulted. So this is when honor can also lead to war. So because they felt like it was insult to their honor, that is why what they did was they started a war. World War One started due to the honor. So Germany also backed Austria to protect its own prestige. And then there's Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Now it's very obvious, we all know. Here, the war was purely due to interest. Saddam wanted Kuwaiti oil fields and CSS, so pure economic interest was involved. So now what we have understood in a classical theory that is by Thucydides, that is the work is called by the three factor. It can be either be fear, it can be interest, or it can be honor. Like Russia invasion of Ukraine is fear based. World War One was honor based, whereas lastly, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait was all about pure economic interest. Similar, we can also consider here, American Iraq War can also be considered in terms of pure economic interest because we know that there were underlying economic interests as well. And then China's annexation of South China Sea, that too, because 90% of the sea is claimed for fish, oil, gas, and it controls 5 trillion annual trade route. So this trade route, it is a very significant choke point, and there's economic and strategic interest involved. So this is also one of the example how interest is something that can lead to war. Then there's Immanuel Kant, and he has his theory that is the democratic peace theory, given in 1795. Immanuel Kant in democratic peace theory simply says that liberal democracies almost never fight wars against each other. Remember when we talked about whether there has to be some anarchy, there has to be some imbalance, and sometimes the states they simply fight. They start wars simply to divert attention from the internal issues. But when there is liberal democracy, what happens is that every person is involved in the whole governmental decision. Every person's will is taken into account, and people by nature, they want peace, they want their interests to be fulfilled, and nobody wants their son to be killed in war. So when there's liberal democracy, people know, and there's freedom of trade, people know that all other parties, they are of some they present some sort of interest to them, and in this interest that acts as a deterrent against the aggression that may fuel the war. So when there is liberal democracy, then two liberal democracies, they will almost never fight war against each other. Now he has given three reasons as well. Number one, he says that every state must be a republic. Republic means that it represents a representative democracy within the rule of law. Now, the reason is that voters do not like to send their own sons to die in war. Number two, state must form a federation of free states like European Union, United Nations, or World Trade Organization, international organization, and trade. They make the war very costly. Thirdly, Cosmopolitan rights, world citizenship, free trade, hospitality, economic interdependence, human rights norms reduce hatred. Remember, economic interdependence is one of the things that is the biggest fortification against war. When the two countries they are economically interdependent, it's very less likely that they would just launch a full-scale war against one another, because they know that everyone is going to suffer from the economic losses. So, and let's see if the theories they are backed up by some, past historical records or not. So, no two genuine democracies have ever fought a full-scale war against each other. So here we can say that Immanuel Kant is kind of right when he's saying that liberal democracies do not fight one another, because no genuine democracies have ever fought a full-scale war against each other, but there are certain exceptions. For example, Kargil or UK-US in 18 and 112. But they are either not fully democratic or at the time, or they were very minor. Secondly, India, USA, India, France, India, Japan, Japan, Germany, Brazil, South Africa, all democracies and zero wars. Now, if the consent of citizen is required in order to decide that war should be declared, nothing is more natural than they would be very cautious in commencing such poor game. So if citizens are asked if they want or if the war should be declared, so it's very natural that people are very cautious and they would never start such a poor regime. That is what Immanuel Kant said in Perpetual Peace. That citizen, and we know that if there is liberal democracy, the consent of citizen is always required. And if the consent of citizens is required, we understand that they're never going to say yes to such a horrible thing, and therefore there will be no war. Now, this has a very strong backing, considering that we have seen the empirical record that too from 1800 to 2025 that no two genuine democracies ever fight a full-scale war against one another. But there are certain limitations. For example, democracies are very aggressive towards non-democracies. Like it's right that two democracies might not fight, with each other or against one another, but democracies can be very aggressive towards the non-democracies. For example, Iraq, Libya, and Vietnam, they are the famous examples. Also, new or illiberal democracies can also fight. For example, Russia and Georgia in 2008, India, Pakistan, both are electoral democracies, but they still fought Kargil War in 1999. Then, after the democratic peace theory of Immanuel Kant, we have Karl Marx, Friedrich Engel's Marx theory of war. We all understand when it comes to Marx that it has to be relevant to capitalism or the money. Now, the core idea is that all major wars under capitalism are caused by economic contradiction and greed of the capitalist class. So it is simply that it's the capitalist class, it's the greed of capitalist class that causes the war. Now, Marx argues that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. He says that monopolies need new markets, they need raw materials, they need cheap labors. So what they do is they colonize, and then what happens is wars happens. So Marx number one argument is imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, and monopolies they need new markets, they need new raw materials, they colonize, and wars happen. For example, World War One was war over the colonies in Asia and Africa. U.S.-China trade war is also one of the example. South China Sea again an example. Now, what the countries are doing, they are simply fighting for markets, rare earths, and for chips. Then there is surplus value and falling rate of profit. Capitalists make less profit at home, so they have to export the capital, and which is something that leads to clash with other capitalism. For example, Arctic opening due to melting ice. Now, Russia, Canada, and USA racing for oil and shipping routes. Now, Arctic is opening due to the melting of ice. So Russia, Canada, USA, they are racing, they are fighting because they want their own oil and shipping routes. And that is something when the two capitalist agendas they would contradict one another, then definitely it would lead to war. Then war also serve as a safety valve. That is, when workers become restless, the war starts to divert class anger. Hitler used this war to save German capitalism. And also in Myanmar, junta and African dictators also use ethnic wars to stay in power. So wars are also used to stay in power. This is what Marx says. Now, he says the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeois. That is Karl Marx. Imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. The struggle for redivision of the world must lead to the war. But here again, we have certain limitations or criticisms. Many wars are not economic. For example, India and Pakistan, it is religious or ideological rather. And when it comes to Israel and Palestine, it is based on identity or it has theological roots as well. So, not all wars are due to the economic reasons. And then there are not all countries are capitalist. Socialist countries also fight war. For example, Vietnam and Cambodia, China and Vietnam, Soviet and Afghanistan. So all these wars, they are for non-economic reasons. Henceforth, these are the certain limitations of the Marx idea of wars. Thirdly, we are going to see three images of war that was given by Kenneth Walls. He has his book is Man, the State, and War. So first image is about the human nature. That is, inside human being there is greed, there is fear, there is aggression, and there is also stupidity. And this is exactly what leads to war. And the proponents, the people who would favor this, would be Hobbes, Machiavelli, and original sin in Christianity, that human beings are naturally greedy, they are fearful, and they are aggressive. So Hitler's personal hatred and Putin's personal worldview, it led to what? It led to Ukraine war. It's the Putin's personal worldview led to Ukraine war. So in this, we are simply saying that it's the human nature that simply leads to war. And Kim Jong un's paranoia also led to the North Korean missile test. Then, second image is about the internal structure of the state. Number one, there's individual and the greed and all the negative emotion that are within him, that are inherited in him. Second is all about the internal structure of state. That is inside the state, then there are bad regimes that can cause war. For example, there can be dictatorship, there can be militarism, there can be capitalism, or there can be religion. So there can be multiple reasons, but they are within the state and they may lead to war. In this here we have the proponent. These are Plato, Spinoza, Marx, and liberal thinkers. They believe that when the regime is bad, it has certain weaknesses or it has certain sore points. Then that is also something that may cause war. For example, in World War II, democratic peace theory can also be applied, but in Nazi Germany, it was a very bad regime, so also led to war. And Myanmar military junta refuses to give power, which caused the civil war. And then third image is about the international system. Number one is about the individual. Number two is about the state, and number three is about the international. It is similar to the one that we covered in the first page. That was individual level, state level, as well as this systemic level. It complements that. Now, third one, international system. In the structure of international system, when there's anarchy, that is that there's no word government, there's security dilemma because everyone is afraid of everyone, which leads to arms race because when everyone is afraid of everyone, everyone wants to protect, their own selves. And in order to protect themselves, what they do is they gather all the ammunition and arsenal, and which is perceived by others as offensive preparation. So that is also something that leads to war. So wars, even if the leaders are angels. So US-China rivalry, again, they only want security, but each arms other feels threatened, and then there is a possible Taiwan war that simply looms. Again, NATO expansion is something that is making Russia feel threatened. And hence, in his fear, he invades Ukraine. So you see, this also somehow overlaps with the Thucydides approach, that is, that war is either due to fear, honor, or it is due to interest. So what we are seeing here is that in absence of the international system, there's security dilemma, there's fear involved, which may lead to war. Now, Walls himself, Kenneth Walls said, wars occur because there is nothing to prevent them. Wars occur when there is nothing to prevent them, means the nothing that should have been there, or something that should have been there, must have been some international system that would assure that would give this sense of mutual trust, cultivate mutual trust within states, so that they wouldn't just feel so threatened and vulnerable. That was all about Kenneth Walls and his three images of war: individual, state level, and international level war. So he says that the permissive cause is always the third image. Third image is all about the anarchy, when there is absence of the central government. First and second images, that is the individual level or the state level, they are only proximate causes. And proximate causes, they are backed when backed by the third permissive cause, eventually leads to war. Now, with many sovereign states, with no system of law enforceable among them, with each state judging its grievances and ambitions according to the dictates of its own reason or desire, conflict is the order of the day. Simply, when we have many states that are sovereign and there is no system of law enforceable among them, so every state is going to judge its own grievances, its own ambitions according to its own reason and desire. So, what will happen is simply conflict will occur. That is what Kenneth Walls said. Now, we are also going to see some modern frameworks. Number one is greed versus grievance. Paul Collier gave this theory. Greed theory says that when there are certain resources that can be looted, for example, diamonds, oil, or rare earth metals, these rare earth minerals, this is something that may lead to war. Second, it is all about the grievances. For example, it can be ethnic hatred or it can be inequality, which can lead to war. So it's either greed or it is grievance. One of other modern reasons is the security dilemma that we have covered before. One country arms for defense, neighbor feels threatened, an arms race happens, and then what happens is eventually leads to war. Thirdly, we understood that internal state of the states also leads to war, in which we have the diversionary war theory. Leaders start small wars abroad to divert attention from the domestic failures. Here we have the Argentina's Falkland War in 1982. So leaders simply start a war because they want to divert the attention from the domestic failures. So if we see the contemporary causes, what we understand in 2025, the wars can also be climate-induced wars, and wars in futures would definitely be climate-induced wars. And in this, we have example of Lake Chad shrinkage, which led to Boko Haram. We know that Chad was the sixth largest lake, and it eventually started shrinking. So remember, it's always that war or radical group survive in two ways. They have to find out grievances, and then what they do is they use that grievances, they channel that grievances, and they offer an alternative, and they simply mobilize people. So, in what happened in Lake Chad shrinkage, this lake was shared by four countries, and when it started getting smaller and smaller, and it was about to disappear, the local communities they suffered a lot, and the government did not pay attention. So, Boko Haram was a group that radical group that rose, and it promised the local communities all its their livelihood, and later it simply took over the lake while enslaving the local people. So, in this, we understand that climate induced wars can also happen. Then there's technology races. Currently, we know that AI, hypersonic missiles, quantum computing, supply chain wars. For example, there is Taiwan semiconductor crisis, that is a supply chain war. Now, what is a supply chain war? Supply chain war is modern and it is non-kinetic form of conflict where nations weaponize global trade networks. What is being weaponized? Global trade networks are being weaponized to harm their rivals. Unlike traditional wars in which we use tanks, in which we use bombs, these fights use tariffs, they use export bans, or these use sanctions, the supply chain wars, and strategic hoarding. And the goal is to disrupt the economy of the enemy. And that is one of the wars, modern wars, that is supply chain war. Wars can also be due to identity or ideology, for example, Hindu, Muslim, Sunni, Shia, Russia, Orthodox civilization narrative. This is also something that can lead to wars. Next, we are going to see what is a total war. As the name suggests, it is a war that will employ the use of, total use of all the resources that one possesses. A war in which entire society, we're not talking only about the soldiers, we're talking all society, men, women, children, factories, railways, farms, everything is mobilized to achieve unconditional surrender of the enemy. So, total war is simply use or expenditure of all possible resources in order to make the enemy surrender or subjugate. So, basically, in such a war, in total war, there is no difference between combatant and a civilian. Everyone is involved. There's strategic bombing of cities. Why? Because we want unconditional surrender of the enemy. There's economic blockade, and then it basically involves using all able-bodied men they are involved in this war. Historically, World War One in 1914 to 1918, it was first industrial total war. World War Two, again, peak of total war during Holocaust. Atom bombs were used, firebombing of Tokyo. So these are the two scenarios in which what happened? Total war happened. That is that there was no difference between the civilian and a soldier, and all the resources were mobilized, and the goal was the ultimate, complete surrender of the enemy. So, once war is forced upon us, there is no alternative than to apply every available means to bring it to a swift and war's very object is victory. That is what Winston Churchill said in 1940 that once war is forced upon us, there is no alternative than to apply every available means to bring it to a swift end. Now, total war, the first person to coin the term or first person to use the term was Erich Ludendorff. He was a German general. He wrote Der Totalkrieg, that means the total war. And we now understand the total war is basically using all the possible resources, mobilizing all the key elements which may help you to get your enemy to its knees. Contemporary relevance, total war is almost impossible today. Why? Because nuclear weapons guarantee that there will be mutually assured destruction. So we understand that, even when we talk about Cold War era, we know that there was no hot war involved because both states somehow knew that the use of nuclear weapons would lead to total destruction. And that is something that fear is something that saved them. So today, again, total war is not possible. Why? Because nuclear weapons, they guarantee that destruction is going to be mutual. It's not that one side that is going to be destructed. Then there's globalized economy. No country can survive total blockade. That is also one of the reasons that total wars do not take place. International laws and war crime trials also save us from the menace of the total war. But Russia Ukraine shows there's almost near total war. Why? Because it involves mobilization of 1 million Russians. It involves attacks on civilian power grid, economic sections never seen before. So basically, Russia is using all the tactics. It is mobilizing its all sources. So therefore, it is very near to the total war. So let's understand if the war is not total war, what it is going to be. It is going to be a limited war. What is a limited war? War fought for limited political objectives using limited forces. When war is fought therefore your political objective is also limited. It's not total annihilation or total surrender of the enemy. That is what you need. You need something. You do have a political agenda, but it is very limited. And so when you have a limited agenda, you use limited forces in a limited geographical area, and you avoid the weapons of mass destruction. Therefore, this war will be called as limited war. Limited objective, limited force use, or within a limited geographical area while avoiding mass destruction. Now, limited war is fought for ends far short than the ruins of enemy society. We do not want to ruin the enemy society. We simply want the ends, the things that are like way less than wanting the total ruin of the enemy, and by means far short of the full exertion of the national power. So there will not be the full exertion of the national power. It won't be exerted. We will use the means, but there will be way less than the full exertion. It won't be the full exertion. That is why we are calling it limited war. There will be exertion, but it will be the exertion to the extent that would be directly proportional to the one that is needed in order to achieve our limited political agenda. And as soon as political agenda is achieved, we let go. We do not want the total surrender or total destruction of the enemy. Now, historically, the example would be Korean War. USA did not invade North Korea, nor it used nuclear weapon. So the Korean War in 1950 to 53, the USA did not invade, nor it used the nuclear weapon. So that is one of the examples of what? That is the example of limited wars. Indo-Pak wars, again, be it 1965 or 1970s as one, or Kargil war, it was also limited. Iran-Iraq War 1980s to 88, again, neither used chemical weapons on cities after 1986, so it was limited. Then there's nuclear age and limited war. Because total victory risks nuclear escalation, great powers fight only limited wars. The power to hurt is the bargaining power. In limited war, the threat that leaves something to chance is more effective. Now, India China border clashes again, it's limited. US China competition in South China Sea, there is freedom of navigation operation, there is no shooting wars. So, we understand that this is one of the example of limited war. Then, lastly, we are going to see asymmetric war. We understand in asymmetric there is going to be no balance. One is going to be a weak side, one is the strongest side. So conflict between actors of vastly unequal military strength. When there are two actors involved, which have unequal military strength. One may be more powerful, other may be a little, on the weak side. So when the weaker side will use unconventional methods to neutralize the stronger side's advantage. Remember, the weaker side, we understand, it is weak because it won't be able to dominate or simply, annihilate the enemy. So what weak side is going to use? It is definitely going to use some unconventional method, and it is going to neutralize. Remember, it's not about the destruction. It is simply about neutralizing the stronger side's advantages. So, in this weak side basically avoids the pitched battles because we know that is a weak side. It does not have that much of the conventional weapons or military strength. And it uses hit and run, it uses terrorism, it uses propaganda, and it uses international law. It uses international law, propaganda, terrorism, and hit and run. Goal is not to win militarily, but to make war too costly for the strong side. Remember, here, basically, asymmetric war is simply a defensive you may say it's a defensive strategy in which weaker side it knows that once the war is started it is going to get crushed to the ground. So what it does is it just makes war expensive for what? For the stronger side. So here it's simple. That is, the guerrilla wins if he does not lose. The conventional army loses if it does not win. Remember, when we simply, Henry Kissinger said on Vietnam, that the guerrilla wins if he does not lose. When we are talking about the guerrilla, again, we will cover the guerrilla war as well. When we are talking about guerrilla, we must understand we are talking about the unconventional methods. We're talking about the side that is weak militarily. So what it is using, it is using its tactics simply to make war expensive for the stronger side. So guerrilla needs, simply the goal of guerrilla is not to lose. That is the win for him. But the conventional army, if it does not win, like if it does not make the other side lose, then we say that it loses. So that is the difference. Historically, when we see the example, we understand American War of Independence, again, colonists versus British Empire, Vietnam War, Soviet and Afghan War, and US war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, you understand that when there's Soviet Afghan war, we are talking about one side that is nuclearly capable, and then there's Afghan side. Again, weak side. Then there's US wars. Again, we are talking superpower, and then Iraq and Afghanistan. So, in such scenarios, the war is usually asymmetric war, and it is also there is also guerrilla war also somehow overlaps with it. Okay, here there is also example of Houthis and US UK naval coalition, then Hamas tunnels and rockets versus Israelis Iron Dome. So we know that here the Israel is the strong side militarily, whereas Hamas is the weaker side. So what it is going to do, it is simply going to make war very expensive for the other side. And then there's civil war. It is a term that is very common these days, particularly. Now, civil war is different from other kinds of war because other kinds of war involve the war between two different nations or two different ideologies, two different countries. But in this, it's basically the war happening within one nation between the two parts of the same nation. So, armed combat within the boundaries of a sovereign state. It is an armed combat which is within the boundaries of the sovereign state between parties that are subject to common authority at the start of hostilities. So basically, they are subject to the common authority, but they will still fight with one another. And the reasons can be many, including the ethnicity and all. So there are different types of civil war. It can be ideological, it can be ethnic, or like in Yugoslavia, ideological, like in Spanish, warlord fragmentation, like Somalia, or it can be a war between the center and the periphery. If they both share unequal advantages, or they have different prosperity levels, or there's some sort of discrepancies or disparities among them. So that is also something that would lead to civil war. Now, civil war is not chaos, it is organized violence with clear patterns. Most killings are by local actors, which settle the private scores under the cover of war. So, civil wars happen when state is weak and when the terrain favors the insurgents. That is what when civil war happens. Then there's guerrilla war. What is guerrilla? Small, mobile bands which use ambush, sabotage, raid, or mobility to fight a stronger enemy. Remember, I told you it is somehow overlapping with the asymmetric warfare as well. So it is small, mobile bands. It's going to be maybe a group of bandits. They simply use ambush, they use sabotage, they use raids and mobility, and they use all of this to fight a stronger enemy. Mao Zedong gives it certain phases. These phases involve there's defense, then there's stalemate, then there's strategic offense, and then there's conventional phase that is only if you win. Guerrilla fighter needs help from people. He's fish, and the people are the sea. So in modern era, we see is there's hybrid guerrilla, there's drone, there's cyber, and then there's also information technology that is used, or digital technology that is social media propaganda. So all of this is known, and we know that when multiple domains are used, we call it as hybrid warfare. For example, Myanmar People Defense Forces and wars today are mixture of war, they are mixture of organized crime as well as human rights violation. Fighters finance themselves through looting, through diaspora funding, through crypto, through money laundering. So they do also involve organized crime. They also involve the violations of human rights. And the new tools are drones, they are cyber attacks, for example. Russia used it, Iran's attack on the Saudi Aramco. And then private military companies also work. Wagner Group. Deepfake propaganda is also a tool of war. And then economic warfare involves sanctions. We all know Russia and, the sanctions due to the Ukraine war. All of this is the part of the modern warfare. So the rules of wars have changed. The role of non-military means achieving political and strategic goals have grown. Now we use non-military means, that is that we are using, supply chain, we are using economic interdependence, we are using information media, cyber, all of that, or propaganda. All of that. We are using non-military means to achieve political, strategic goals, and these means have increased in so many cases that they have exceeded the power of weapons. The non-military means now have exceeded the power of weapons. So simply let's conclude it. Has not ended. Its shape has only changed. Total wars are that because of the nuclear weapons. Most 21st century conflicts are long, they are low intensity, they are asymmetric, or they are civil war that are fought inside the states, or they are fought across the porous borders. That is all about the wars.